We're going to conclude the day with a session with Wendell Wallach and James Hughes and Gerald Huff, all of whom are some of the top thinkers, ongoing thinkers, multi-year thinkers about the issues that we covered today. And we're going to have a discussion amongst ourselves to try to tie together some of the threads, weave together some of the threads of what we heard today. So I'd like to welcome them to the stage. Thank you all. I'd like to open up by asking the following question. We heard about the phrase a few times, techno-optimists and techno-pessimists. And the way that was described in shorthand was the extreme techno-optimists think that we've been through this before and this will all work itself out. That creative destruction happens, and we are on the verge of an unprecedented period of wealth creation due to new technologies, which will may not even have much of a hitch at all. The extreme on techno-pessimists think that there's almost nothing we can do to stop the fundamental erosion of the employment which keeps most of the population financially secure and able to go about their lives. And this is going to happen very, very rapidly. And there's something so different about this moment now that there really is no good solution. So I'd like a comment from each of you about where you place yourself on the spectrum and why.
Well, I guess I'll open up with that. I use the techno-optimist, techno-pessimist quite often in nearly every talk I give, in fact. But I then usually juxtapose that with saying that most of us do tend to see technology as a source of promise and productivity, and yet there is this considerable disquiet about how this is all unfolding. And I think the real challenge is not whether you're a pessimist or optimist, but what is and what isn't inevitable. What kind of initiatives can we take that could truly make a difference? And if we can't make a difference, but there are certain inevitabilities, but they are moving us toward these crises, because certainly if you have technological unemployment, vast numbers of people are without jobs, and you don't have some form of redistribution or some distribution crisis that gets solved, you're going to have a crisis. So it's really just a question of whether we can intelligently address these pressures, anticipate them, and put in motion the kinds of forces or give some degree of shape, or whether the forces that are in motion are going to drive us toward crises, and then it's just a question of at what stage in those crises do we act, or if you take something like Syria, do we not act? Do we really lead to the destruction of a society, which could be the destruction of this society?
I always think there's a problem if you describe yourself as an optimist or a pessimist, because you're just confessing that you're biased in some way. And I try not to, as I think we all do. I think there are people who try not to be biased, who end up with very pessimistic conclusions that I understand, and those who end up with optimistic conclusions that I understand. I think both kinds of outcomes are possible. I think it's possible we could end up under the jackbooted, robot domination, and with a small elite, and the rest of us immiserated, and basic income being a couple pennies a day so that we can take our meth. I think that those are possibilities, and there's also possible that we could end up with an egalitarian society, a new social revolution, a new wave of global solidarity, or whatever. But it's all dependent on historical contingency and how well we organize. So the fact that we're starting the conversation now is what will help tip the balance one direction or the other.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point. I'd echo that it's really about what we choose to do. You know, both John Markoff and Eric Bernelson and Andrew McAfee concluded their recent books on this topic by saying it's really not about the technology. It's about the choices we make. And it's about having meetings like this and generating the discussion that creates you know, what the future is going to be. So I don't think it's predetermined. I think it is going to depend on what we choose to do and how we choose to organize and the actions that we take and the kind of society that we choose to create. You know, Joe Stiglitz talked about rewriting the rules. This stuff is not set in stone. You know, this did not come from on high or from some natural law. The way that the society works is a set of rules that we write, and we have the power to rewrite those to create the kind of future that we want to.
Thank you. My comment on this, or riffing off your comments, would be that Bob Reich today talked about the actually, this is a much longer discussion, so I'm gonna, that would take us into a longer discussion. I may go back to that. I want to hear more from you. So the question of redistribution came up quite a bit today, I think repeatedly. Almost every speaker, whether it was their formal topic or whether it was a ripple effect of a question, brought up redistribution. In fact, I would say that was one of the if we had to pick, one of the few things that would determine the direction, whether we're going to have the optimistic or pessimistic scenario. Even people who made a quick comment about it, that would have a huge impact on their answer. So I want to ask you now, do you believe that the question of redistribution is at the core of the future that's going to be unfolding, which could generate lots of wealth? Or even if it doesn't, redistribution could be key to how we proceed. Do you agree with that? And if so, as a follow-up, the other theme related to that that came up was basic income. So is redistribution at the core of this? And is basic income the best way, in your opinion, for us to go forward?
So I do think it is a problem of distribution. You know, in the second machine age, they talk about the terms bounty and spread. The bounty from having these new machines and these new capabilities in not just robotics and AI, but all the other technologies in healthcare and manufacturing, et cetera, has the potential to be huge, a huge amount of wealth generation. The question is, how is that distributed? So I do think that is the core problem. Historically, for the last couple hundred years at least, we've had this very virtuous cycle of companies in the market economy paying workers for their labor, which was required to produce the goods and services that they were then able to consume with the income they got from working. And that's really been an incredibly powerful kind of wheel of progress ratcheting us forward. And as human labor is less and less required in the economy, that virtuous cycle breaks down. If you still want a market economy, and there are people who don't, but if you still do because you believe it's one of the key inventions that's enabled us to create all of this progress and increase in standard of living in the last 200 years, then you need some way for people to continue to be consumers in the economy, to continue that virtuous cycle. And so I think keeping that circular flow of money going in the economy is the key to continued progress. And so that is going to imply, if selling labor is not the way to do it anymore because of automation and other tools, then we'll need distribution. I think basic income is one of the most promising ways that I've seen to do that. It seems to be one of the simplest solutions with the least amount of overhead and bureaucracy. And the universality is extremely important because those are the programs that have no moral taint associated with them. It's basically an argument that everyone deserves a distribution of the bounty of what we all have created over centuries of effort through this incredible system that we've created. And that it provides a foundation that everyone can build on to the best of their abilities to pursue their own passions and interests. And so I guess the short version is, yes, we're going to need some form of redistribution or pre-distribution. That was a new term I heard today, which I think is very powerful. Working within the system to pre-distribute the money, and basic income to me seems a very kind of logical, universal approach to the problem.
So definitely I support basic income as a solution to the inegalitarian nature of a lot of the different kinds of social safety nets that we have now and will have in the future, especially as I was so glad that we talked about the demographic facts today, the growing old age dependency ratio, just the inegalitarian nature of having two working people supporting one senior citizen, and where it's now 4 or 5. For the future, I think what we need to do, though, is confront the fact that there's such a dominance of austerity political logic in the world, and there are political and psychological attitudes that undergird resistance to both social safety nets and to the eventual basic income. There's the attitude that people can't be trusted with leisure and economic security, and they'll just take meth and watch TV all the time. There's the attitude that it's always some other group over there, immigrants or black people or something, that are sucking the social benefits out of the hardworking people over here, the real Americans, as Sarah Palin says. And there's the attitude that the government can't do anything right, which is, endemic. It's intrinsic to the sorry, no offense to Silicon Valley, but it's intrinsic to a lot of the Silicon Valley libertarian enthusiasm about, the changes to come, is that we'll just make government irrelevant. This is going to require government. Bitcoin is not going to create a basic income for people. You may, if you have a basic income that's private, that's called charity. You're putting money from one person's pocket into another, and guess what? It doesn't work very well to solve the world's problems. So basic income, I think we need to engage as a political project that's an extension of the existing fight to defend the welfare state.
I think it's probably clear to everyone who's spent this day here now that there's an awful lot of different topics that are being subsumed under this term, technological unemployment. And they're everything to do with the anomalies of capitalism in this era, and how there is a skewing of what happens to capital and how that gets distributed, to issues that we haven't even talked about here today. The fact that people are living longer and they're retiring later and opening up fewer jobs for those who are entering the workplace. There's just a whole confluence of different factors that are contributing to what are now being experienced as a real imbalance in our political economy. I personally think that technological unemployment has already begun, in the sense that technology in these many forms is functioning as a downward pressure on job creation and wage growth. So that we already have, and we already have this skewing of how capital gets distributed under the new economy. So perhaps it's only distribution that's the issue that we've been talking about, that we need to all focus on. Whether there will or will not be jobs, well, we're going to have to wait and witness how many new jobs get created. Whether people must work or not work, or whether they're creative enough to create new activities, I have no illusion that people won't be creative enough to find things to do, things that they find fulfilling and exciting. But what is not at all clear is how we're going to pay for our lives. Not at all clear what happens when wages are no longer the way in which a significant proportion of the society takes care of their needs, and that's already occurring. That's not something in the distance. That may just be exacerbated by more and more intelligent machines with functional equivalency taking more and more jobs. So what is and what isn't happening? Well, we're in the midst of a political economy with so many feedback loops that you can make all kinds of arguments about what might or might not be going on and how that will be mitigated by one thing or another. But what isn't unclear is that we're already in a distribution crisis. We're already in a crisis where how people get the capital to sustain themselves, that's already a crisis for a large percentage of the population. And if these kinds of technological pressures we've been talking about today continue, it's just going to exacerbate.
To continue on that, I mean, I think Joe Stiglitz gave a pretty good case to make decoupling the whole technological unemployment discussion from the income inequality discussion or the distribution discussion. In other words, I agree that it is clear that this is an issue whether technological unemployment exacerbates it or not. And so a bonus would be that if we address the income inequality issue or the distribution issue in and of itself, that we might be inoculating ourselves to some degree as a side benefit from the technological unemployment crisis that may hit in some degree of severity, which we can't predict. So I think that's an excellent point about that being a meta issue. One thing I want to point out is that about the redistribution question and the basic income question, in the 19th century, the epicenter, arguably, at a certain point of the Industrial Revolution, in other words, the epicenter in a way of disruptive technologies and technological unemployment of its time was in Germany. And under Bismarck, the first social welfare state initiatives were born not because wealthy capitalist Germans were really interested in expanding the distribution of wealth, but because they were threatened by communism and other revolutionary movements at the time. And the idea was, to use Bob Reich's phrase today, saving capitalism, in order to save the system, people needed to be given some sort of safety net. In other words, if we were going to have that degree of creative destruction and we were going to buy into it, then we needed to, as part of the package, have some kind of safety net. So we already have an example of periods of massive industrial disruptive change leading to, for political preemptive reasons, a willingness to save capitalism by giving, not for altruistic reasons, an extended safety net. So I think that's probably likely to happen anyway, given the income inequality and growing income inequality issues, which are likely going to generate politics in reaction to that, which we're probably already beginning to see signs of. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, and I think your point about addressing meta problems is really important from the political point of view. Those of us who believe in technological unemployment are still a small minority in the economic or policy wonk or political circles. But there are people who, like Auteur, who believe that technology is driving inequality and that there are policies that need to be done to address that, or to address what kinds of jobs people might need to be educated for in the future. And we can agree with a lot of those transitional policies, a shorter work week, the expansion of the social safety net, and so forth. And I think that we need to consciously think about framing our policy questions, not so that you have to sign on and say, yes, robots are eventually going to take every job, and there's nothing safe, and you have to agree to that agenda before we can have a discussion. We have to have a broader political coalition that includes those who are worried about, adjacent issues.
I'm going to switch gears for a second and talk about a version of the phrase leisure. The techno-optimists often talk about the idea that, some of them talk about, not only are we going to sail through this the way we always have, with a net gain in jobs, different kind of jobs we can't imagine right now, but some of them also talk about a kind of utopian vision of a society where we can finally get rid of the drudgery of work. And so in that society, the idea is that there, again, probably through redistribution, but there's a security that people feel, financial security, and a way to get income without having to work. Let's talk about what that work might be like for a moment. What might that society look like? People talk about a flowering, an unprecedented cultural flowering of creativity, when people no longer have to struggle for their daily existence. And we're not talking about the flowering of cultural expression that the aristocrats of 17th century Europe had as the only people with leisure time at the time. We're talking about even someone who might have their basic needs met. And we're seeing that in subcultures all around the world, particularly for young people who don't seem to have visible means of support and don't require actually a lot to live, but live a very culturally oriented existence. And they're a generation that doesn't know that that's unusual. And a lot of their peers see it as quite normal. So is that the beginning of an expression of what we might see in a world where the obsession with survival is no longer the main issue? How might that change how people live?
Some of us thought we were seeing that 50 years ago. You know, those of us of the 60s generation, we were all being pushed through higher education. We would sit down and we said, but where are the jobs? What are we all supposed to do once we have this education? But that was before we had, you know, the welfare state sheets and all kinds of other things that suddenly made it seem like that if you weren't engaged in a productive function within the society, you had no value at all. So I don't think there's any question that you have certain kinds of flowering, but I think we should also not get totally carried away with this. Just think about your own lives. I would imagine for most of you in this room, you spend a good part of your lives compromising yourself in order to keep a job or at least you have at some points during your lives, and you haven't had the time to devote to the things that you care about the most. So that flowering is certainly going to happen. Other people have claimed, well, the flowering is going to be, you're going to have time for creativity and meditation. I suspect that's not true or not attractive to anything other than a small percentage of the society. That not everybody's going to want to be in lifetime education or go sit cross-legged and try and transcend the physical world for long periods of time. So I think this is the difficulty in this issue of flowering is what is provided for people who want some kind of meaningful work? Not necessarily that work is what they earn money from, but that want some kind of meaningful activity or meaningful expression. Our society is not at all geared for that at this time. Other societies such as Japan and well, there are a number of countries you can point to that are high-touch societies. So they do create jobs for people, and they have created a context in which even just greeting people at a door day in and day out seems to be meaningful to some people. So I think we do also have to look at that kind of flowering.
I think one of the open questions is what the market's going to be for people having a preference for the human provided over the machine provided. I mean, my daughter's an opera singer, and 100 years ago, your only option, 120 years ago, your only option for opera would have been to go to an opera performance. And then there was radio, and then there were phonograph records and all kinds of recordings. But there's still opera singers, and there's still people who prefer to do that rather than listen to it on the radio or some other way. And I think there could be a kind of massification of a preference for the artisanal, the human, and the handmade, paid or unpaid. I'm not quite sure. It may be that people getting together and singing music together, maybe increasing activity in the future or something like that. Mm-hmm. But also paid labor in this transition. So that's what I find hard to imagine, what a society of creative endeavor might look like and whether that could support an economy.
Yeah, I think like most questions like this, there won't be any one thing. So that it won't be only a creative, a flowering of creative activity. I think it's very hard for us to predict what that society would look like. But it seems like it's going to be a mix from people who just sit on their couch, not watching TV, but with their VR headset on, to creative entrepreneurial efforts. We do have a whole segment of society right now who are retired people who seem to manage to fill their time in ways that are meaningful to them. And so there's clearly models of community interaction, civic engagement that could attract lots of time from people. And so I'm not so much worried about that problem as long as society has the mindset that this is a positive development for civilization, and how exciting it is that we all now get to participate in this new type of society, as opposed to it being this kind of disaster scenario where everyone has the mindset this is, we have no more jobs, and it becomes a very negative thing. And someone mentioned the very early on the kind of Protestant work ethic, and if we that everyone has to work and earn their survival. If we focus on changing that mindset and celebrating what automation and what the technology we've created is now delivering in terms of liberating people to pursue their passions, their interests, whatever they may be, in a great diversity of things they're going to pursue, then I think it can be a positive outcome. So I'm optimistic about that.
But I wonder what everyone here thinks about the counter argument. So you have a vision that we're all going to be positive about the shift. But
I have a hope.
Yeah, a hope. But the present narrative, at least the dominant narrative, seems to be a great fear of sloth, which is also the narrative that raises the question about whether guaranteed income is quite the right way to frame what we're talking about here. And I'm not sure how I even feel about guaranteed income. I feel fine about guaranteed income in the sense of guaranteed security for everyone, but part of me would like people to do something with that guarantee from the society. And so I don't know if it should just be guaranteed, but if there should be some request for some justification, a project statement of what you will do with your guaranteed income. The problem is it's very difficult to move in that direction without opening up yourself to this world of all kinds of bureaucracies and checks and balances that we don't want, but we are probably going to have to forge some solution that deals with the fact that there will be this fear of sloth, and it may not be just a celebration of this utopia.
The French theorist Andre Gortz was a staunch advocate of basic income, but he was opposed to an unconditional basic income. He thought that basic income had to be conditional on democratic participation. That you had to vote, you had to participate in your local, neighborhood council or whatever, and again, that would require the kind of bureaucracy that we're trying to get away from with a basic income, but it would have other salutary benefits.
Well, that could be digitized. I mean, there wouldn't be a lot of bureaucracy.
That's right. It could just be the chip in your head that's running the democracy in the background.
I'd like now to talk about the issue of forces, drivers that make it seem likely that businesses, industries, etc., will move towards automation and non-human labor. So, for example, we heard this is something else that seemed a theme today. We heard about some demographic issues, particularly in societies with shrinking populations or aging populations. That seems to me a no-brainer, that when you combine that in an era of technologies that can actually do labor that are available, it's not simply, as we heard, going to be sufficient to have migration make up for the traditional growth drivers for those economies. So it seems, again, that that's an example of something that is pushing us, or pushing certain societies toward leaning towards using automation. One of the things that we've seen recently is the minimum wage push, which I'm for, but one of the things that finally, let's say the fast food industry, for example, has been giving in on the minimum wage. It's been giving in on a minimum wage for years it didn't, and now it's giving in right at the time when it's testing automated restaurants. Uber is very happy to be one of the fastest growing and largest human employers right now, with plans openly stated to replace the human drivers with autonomous vehicles. So we're seeing forces at work that, from a pure traditional business perspective and a pure traditional economic growth perspective for national policies, right at the time when the technologies are available, it seems very tempting. And I don't see countervailing forces. Do you agree with that? And what are some examples, if there are, of countervailing forces?
Yeah, to me, it seems pretty much everything is aligned towards adopting more automation from the perspective of just the basics of how competitive market capitalism works. I mean, that's the driver, is to reduce costs. I think you had two speakers today, John Hagel and David Norfords, who were talking about a different way for companies to think about what their purpose is, and to attempt to put people at the center of it rather than profits. I think they're doing important work, but I don't see it right now as a countervailing force. What you have is the shareholder value, law, which of course was not a law until just recently, driving the decision making in most companies, and that does not put people first. So I see a very large array of forces pushing towards more automation over time, and some efforts within market capitalism to push against that, but not very strong forces right now.
I would point out that it's not just the private sector that feels these pressures. This is the first recession since the 1930s that hasn't seen a growth in government payrolls. In fact, a reduction in government payrolls. And so I think that there's going to be, and I think one of the policy responses that will come once people begin to have that tipping point and begin to accept that there is technological unemployment, is they'll say, well, there are all these things that need to be done, and we'll pay people to take care of the seniors, and we'll pay people to plant trees. But guess what? There's a tree planting robot. Guess what? There's going to be home care telemonitoring that you don't actually need home health nurses in the same way you did in the past. So I think that the same forces are at work in the public sector and will double the impact of technological unemployment on society.
I can think of two things that are factors. One of the arguments about why we've had such anemic productivity and wage growth and job growth is that people actually don't have the capital to drive it. So if that's true, and I don't know if it's true because I can't do that kind of analysis, if that's true, and there are economists who are looking at whether that's true, then you suddenly have the problem for businesses about whether there's enough consumers out there.
Right.
Now, right now, they can go to other countries and get the consumers. Apple can go to China and they can sell iPhones. But if they see that there is a ceiling on the number of consumers out there because people don't have the capital, then that becomes a driving force to change the equation. Henry Ford dealt with that. He had a problem that he could build all these Model Ts, but he didn't have anybody to buy them. And he raised wages multifold for his workers above anything that existed within the economy at that time, and forced nearly everybody else to follow suit. So suddenly he had created consumers for himself. The other thing that I think can drive business toward this, but it has a little bit to do with how the narrative gets framed, is if technological unemployment is really occurring, particularly in the field where intelligent systems are showing functional equivalency and replacing more and more jobs, and people do not see the job growth, but they identify that as the problem, you have one more factor feeding into social instability. And you might get a legitimation crisis, a term that Habermas used to talk about a time when people no longer have faith in their government. Well, we're already seeing that.
Yeah.
So that could be something that could exacerbate the temperament that is now occurring. But there are so many other factors that could feed into that. I think private enterprise could respond, and even government could respond if they did see that we were coming close to a tipping scale towards social instability. When or whether they will see that, well, we'll find out a little bit about that during this election, I think.
We're going to need to wrap up soon, but I want you quickly, succinctly to say the one thing that you heard today that's sticking in your mind more than you expected. Start with Gerald.
I liked the notion that I heard a couple things. First was, as I mentioned before, the pre-distribution idea, which is a way of avoiding the notion of income taxes on individuals who feel like they have earned that money and you are now taking it away from them. So a couple of our speakers talked about moving inside the system, whether it's carbon taxes or other fees or value-added tax or something that happens within the market system to redistribute in a new way. Or, you know, Bob Wright talked about patents. So I think that was one important idea. I think the other thing that came out in some of the summaries was experimentation. And for some of these ideas of redistribution or basic income, there have been experiments recently in the developing world. There were some back in the 70s in the developed world. Netherlands is looking at doing some. I think we need to unleash a lot of experimentation in this area to see what kinds of things are going to work. No one has the silver bullet magic answer right now. Our society is so complex that to think that we can just draft a single piece of legislation and kind of ram it through Congress and that it's going to solve all of our problems. I think we need a lot more information about how solutions can work, and experimentation is one way to do that. And so that's the other thing I heard that I think is important from today. James.
So it's not a new idea because McAfee and Brynildson have addressed it, but the idea that automation is going to have, in the developed world, is going to have a big impact on the developing world's path to sustainable economic development. And the fact that David Auteur, while being a staunch critic of the idea of technological unemployment in the developed world, thought it was going to have that effect in the developing world. The fact that he, signed on to that got me thinking. And there's been an idea in the development circles for a while that there may be a path of leapfrogging in the developing world too, that because of cell phones they won't need landlines, and maybe they could do 3D printing instead of traditional manufacturing that they never got. And I think that this is an open question. I mean, what's the effect going to be on inequality at a global scale if we don't keep sending them our industrial jobs and we just keep it all here for our robots?
Pre-distribution is not a new idea to me, but I think it's a powerful idea, and I think that got illustrated when it got brought up today. Jerry Kagan has a book that just came out called Humans Need Not Apply, which is also about technological unemployment, and he goes into that idea in a little bit more detail, so that might be of interest to some people.
Jerry Kaplan.
Kaplan. Jerry Kaplan,
yeah.
Excuse me, yeah. Yeah. The other one's the psychologist.
Yeah.
Yeah. Strangely enough, the other things that stuck in my mind are just things that I thought were wrong, or illustrating some of what I think is just the misunderstanding of what's going on right now. So Larry Summers early this morning said, well, if we were really having technological unemployment, it was happening because you were having these machines replacing humans because they were more productive. Wouldn't we see this productivity growth? And I think that misunderstands what's going on. We're in a competitive environment, and the replacement is happening just to keep pace. The replacement is happening, just to lower costs so that you can maintain, if not grow, your own share of the market. So we don't necessarily get productivity growth from technological replacement of jobs. And I think this is this difficulty. There's a lot of just bad ideas out there. You hear over and over again that we're going to create more jobs by increasing productivity. And this becomes the excuse for all kinds of austerities in our society. But if in fact increased productivity is only happening through technology filling more and more jobs, you then don't get those jobs that are being promised. And I think it's these ideas that I keep hearing reverberating even among those who are trying to show some degree of sensitivity to the issues that we've been raising throughout the day. That's what reverberates in my mind.
And you just reminded me, a hat tip to Scott Santens for his bullshit jobs answer to the productivity paradox. It's the jobs are being hollowed out of their productivity at the same time. So. Yeah.
With the phrase bullshit jobs, we're going to end this panel.
Sorry.
And I want to thank the panelists, and I'm going to have some wrap-up remarks, and then we will head to the reception.
Right.
So thank you, panelists.
Thank you.
Thank you.